this event is happening mostly thanks to Nisha Suarez. Nisha, why don't you raise your hand? Woo. Who is Congressman Moulton's immigration caseworker and district aide. And kind of the way this happened is that I've been trying to look for more and more visibility for our Back for Justice, Burlington Area Clergy for Justice, Jericho walks in right down the street of the ICE office in Burlington. So I decided to call Congressman Moulton's office to find out if he might be interested in coming to one of those. And so I spoke to Nisha. Nisha got right back to me, and we ended up having a long talk. And then she was kind enough to meet me at the temple. We had a very long talk about the issues of immigration. And then during the course of that conversation, she suggested that maybe we would have a town hall. The congressman might be willing to come and do a town hall on the topic of immigration. And here we are. So it's really thanks to her. So before we continue, I just want to introduce a number of people who are here in no particular order. Margaret Fleischman, where are you? Margaret, she's a member of the Bedford Town Select, I always say select people, selectmen. Reverend Annie Gonzalez-Milliken and Reverend John Gibbons, who are the ministers at First Parish Unitarian Universalist Church in Bedford. We have Reverend Angela Wells-Bean, who's our next door neighbor at the UCC Church, right next door, and her husband Andy Wells-Bean. And I'm really thrilled that this is a special day for them. This is the first day that that Angela's back from maternity leave, and she's choosing to spend her first day back with us. So Happy New Year! Happy New Year! We have Bill Houghton. Bill, where are you? He's the chaplain at Lady Clinic, and Martha Simon, who is the chair of the Burlington School Committee, and she's a member of our congregation, member of our school committee, of our social justice committee, and. So before, I'm going to call on PHYLLIS NEUFELD, who's the chair of our Temple Social Justice Committee, and FRAN Rosenberg, who's an active member of our committee. They're going to be talking in a moment about why this is important for the Jewish community. But first, I'm just going to set the stage a little bit. Why are we here, and why at this moment in time? We are a nation of immigrants. But our country also has a sordid past of bigotry and racism, starting with Christopher Columbus treating Native Americans as savages, to the enslavement of African Americans, to interring Japanese citizens, to suspicions about the Irish, Italians, Muslims, those from Middle Eastern countries, and many other ethnic and religious groups. Almost everyone in this room is descended from immigrants who were welcomed here, many who sought to escape desperate situations in their countries of origin. But our country also has a history of turning away boatloads of people, like the St. Louis, a ship filled with Jews fleeing the Holocaust, who were sent back to their death. Less than 100 years ago, Germans, Austrian, Poles, Hungarians, and citizens of other European countries allowed more and more restrictive laws to be passed against Jews because they bought into the racism, xenophobia, and bigotry of their elected officials. Some brave souls helped save our people, but most stood by silently or actively participated in the imprisonment and slaughter of 6 million Jews and 5 million others. I grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust. I'm still haunted by the newsreels I watched as a young child in religious school of thousands of Nazis goose-stepping in military parades, saluting their wild-eyed Führer, emaciated inmates wearing identical striped rags, peering lifelessly from behind a barbed wire of concentration camps, without proper nourishment or hygiene or medical care, abused in every conceivable way. One of the survivors of that atrocity is our temple member, Agnes Bales. Agnes, want to raise your hand? She was a 5-year-old child in Budapest, Hungary, when she watched the Hungarian Arrow Cross take away her father and then her mother, leaving her and her 9-year-old brother, George, living alone in their apartment. Neighbors took them to an orphanage where they lived in crowded, unbearable conditions Until then, 10-year-old George figured out how to escape with her through a fence, saving them both from death. They ended up living in a ghetto with a semi-relative until the war was over and her mother was able to return from a concentration camp. After over a year of separation, it took Agnes a while to even recognize her mother. She never saw her father again. I have to confess that I never quite understood or connected with the enormity, the pain, the suffering, and the devastation of the Holocaust until I began to see the horrific images of the immigrant internment camps in our country. Pictures of people crowded together behind chain-linked fences, parents separated from their children, sleeping on cold, hard concrete floors under thin silver blankets. Videos of children crying for their parents, being herded like cattle. Reports of sick children, abused children, people who have not had a shower in so long that it is unbearable even for visitors to be in their presence. People who have grown up in our country suddenly being rounded up, being separated from their families, sent back to their deaths. I will never forget watching with my own eyes a group of 6 men and 1 woman being led out of the ICE office right down the street, their hands and feet shackled to each other, wearing prison clothes as if they were hardened criminals. Our nation's leader is modeling and encouraging racism and hate. I see political rallies of people chanting, "Send them back," cheering for the racist, xenophobic, hate-filled remarks of our national leaders. As I have been watching all these images, it was as if a curtain lifted, or a fuzzy, distant image came into focus. It is only now that I understand the cruelty which human beings are capable of inflicting upon one another in the name of nationalism. It is only now that I see how easy it was for so many people to become convinced to join the Nazi Party. We are here at this moment because it is happening again, right here, right now. We Jews know what happens when people do not stand up to hate. The same pattern of racism which happened less than 100 years ago in Europe is happening on our watch. The Talmud teaches, "Do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor." We know what happens when people are silent in the face of evil. I recently saw a meme on Facebook that whatever you are doing right now is what you would have done or not done during the Holocaust. Never again is now. This is why we are here, right now. And it can't just be here and now. No matter how tired we may grow of the struggle, we have no choice but to keep on pursuing it. The values and soul of our country and our neighbors are at stake. I'm so grateful that Congressman Moulton and State Representative Ken Gordon have come here to explain what they are doing to help this crisis. And so now I'd like to invite PHYLLIS and FRAN to come up and say a few words.
Good afternoon. Jewish tradition places great importance on just treatment of immigrants. Our faith demands of us concern for the stranger in our midst at least 36 ways. Leviticus commands, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do them wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be as one of your citizens. You shall love them as you love yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Our own people's history as strangers reminds us of the many struggles faced by immigrants today. Our story as a Jewish people, one with repeated displacement and migration, sensitizes us to the experiences of immigrants today, and we affirm our commitment to supporting them and our outrage at what is happening to them. Temple Shalom Emeth's Social Justice Committee was born in 2016 and voted unanimously to focus on immigration and immigrants based on our Jewish values. We saw this issue as the most pressing one of our time for us as Jews. One of our first actions was to have many of our members volunteer at the Bedford UU Church, which houses a guest. In 2018, Temple Shalom Emeth's board voted to become a sanctuary supporter. The Sanctuary Coalition Covenant reads, "As people of faith and conscience, we are called to welcome the stranger, protect the vulnerable, and accompany the oppressed. As diverse communities of faith, we are called to respond to the injustice we are witnessing in the immigration and deportation policies of our nation. Grounded in moral conviction and our faith traditions, we pledge to become a sanctuary coalition to advocate for just immigration policies and an end to unjust deportations, and to support members of our community under threat of deportation." 12 of our members are currently active in volunteering at the First Parish Church in Bedford. In addition to our work at the First Parish, understanding that all immigrants need our help, we have worked with other organizations to reach out to immigrants in need. Our faith demands of us concern for the stranger in our midst. I am appalled by what I see happening in my homeland, and I believe that's why we're all here today. Thank you for coming.
Congressman, Representative, thank you for being here with us today to talk about immigration. This is obviously a critical issue for all Americans, but as you've just heard, it's especially carries particular weight for American Jews. When I listen to the news over this past year and hear that we're no longer talking about sensible immigration policies, I hear language that frightens me as people in power talk about desperate refugees as less than human and undeserving of basic human rights. I find myself replaying over and over again the German accented voice of my grandpa Paul as he told me how he, my grandmother, and my infant father left Austria in 1938. He was a proud immigrant and a proud American. He was intensely patriotic. The American flag was always hanging, and he always voted Democrat. But he also warned us the horrors of the Holocaust can happen anywhere. My story is similar to that of many American Jews. My father was born in Vienna in 1938 into a well-educated middle-class family. Although throughout my grandfather's teenage and young adult years, conditions for Jews were rapidly deteriorating and anti-Semitism was rising, he was convinced that his friends and neighbors, good, decent Austrian people, wouldn't allow things to go too far. He continued to believe this when he was not allowed to attend university. He continued to believe this as Jewish businesses were seized. He continued to believe this as family members left Europe and borders began to close. In 1939, the Nazis knocked on the door. They had come to take the apartment and told my grandparents that they had 48 hours to leave with their baby. In that moment, my law-abiding, patriotic Austrian grandfather began to take the illegal acts of a desperate man. He lied to the authorities. He broke the laws of his home country in order to bring his family to safety. They were lucky. Family in the U.S. were able to provide them with a legal means of entry, but many of their relatives were left behind to be killed in Nazi death camps because countries throughout the world, including the U.S., would not open their doors. It scares me that in America today, we are hearing refugees demonized for their race, religion, or country of origin. It frightens me that instead of seeing people in desperate circumstances in need of our great country's assistance, we are seeing criminals or adversaries. It frightens me that some of my students where I teach feel as scared in America today as my grandparents did in Nazi-occupied Austria. As an American and the Jewish child of refugees, I'm eager to hear your thoughts on this critical topic. Thank you for being here.
Wanted to mention that this is a very emotional topic for all of us, and my one request is that we allow the Congressman and the State Rep to speak without being interrupted, and we want to be respectful of each other during this important conversation. So it's now my honor and privilege to introduce State Representative Ken Gordon, who is also a good friend, very good friend. We talk maybe 5 times a week at least. He's helped my son through numerous apartment issues. And I also have informed, every time he comes here, I tell him that if he steps foot in our temple one more time, he has to be a member. So yeah, you owe us a lot of money right now. State Representative Ken Gordon has represented the Middlesex 21st District in the Massachusetts House of Representatives since 2012. The Middlesex 21st District includes Burlington, Bedford, and Wilmington's Precinct 3. He's the vice chair of the Joint Committee on Economic Development and a co-sponsor of a bill calling for driver's licenses for undocumented residents. He's a Bedford resident and a member of the Democratic Party, and it's my privilege and honor to introduce State Representative Gordon.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and thank you for including me in this important discussion today. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to the speakers who came before us to put in perspective things that I've been thinking about for quite some time. The message that I hear is that now is the time to do something. Things are bad. You're here because you've got concerns about the way that our policy has been playing out. But if we do nothing, it will get worse. It's sure to get worse. And therefore, as the rabbi said, it's now. The time is now. As a parent, we're confronted with a situation oftentimes from our kids when they're little. When they run into the room, sometimes, and I've thought about this idea that sometimes when our kids come in the room and they're crying and they say, there's something under my bed, there's something in the closet. Kids have an imagination. And as good parents, we tell them, no, that's not the case. Don't worry, there's nothing to be afraid of. We comfort them, There's nothing to be afraid of. What seems to have gone on in this country from the point of view of the president and the Senate that empowers him is the strategy is, hey, wait a minute, yeah. The brown people that you see out there, they really are at your door, ready to take something from you. And I'm the only one that can protect you from that. We've heard that line before. They can use fear, xenophobia, and racism from some people in this population and turn it to their advantage, because really what they're really after is the consolidation of their power. And how can they do that if the people that they're really standing up for are the top 1% of the top 1%? They don't have enough votes. So they have to figure out ways to get those votes. And I truly believe that the why answer to the White House, to the federal government empowered by Republicans in the Senate, and I'm sorry to sound so political, but it just happens to be the way this plays out, is that in order to consolidate power and in order to get votes, they have to try to gather power from those masses by, instead of telling them, no, the reasons for your problems is because we have a changing technology and the jobs that you've had are changing now, and we can re-educate you, we can introduce you to this new economy. That's a little too complicated. If the reason is that someone's at your door trying to take something from you that you'll never get back, that's easy for them to understand, and it's hard for us to battle against. Today, in the State House, there's a hearing on a bill that I co-sponsored, which calls for the ability for people who are not here with documentation to get a driver's license. Essentially, the registry won't ask them to prove their legal residency. I was on the Transportation Committee last year when it was heard. Today, I received 9 phone calls, 2 emails, all of them against, all of them angry, all of them somewhat panicked. I asked Cody, my staffer, well, what time does Howie Carr go on? Because usually you could figure out the timing of those calls from that. And today and in past years when that's happened, I asked the why question. Okay, so tell me, I understand why you're so incensed that you picked up the phone or you sent me an email. Why is this so important to you? And they say, well, because these people shouldn't be here, they're illegal. And I said, okay. If you believe that, then you really don't believe that not having a piece of paper will stop them from driving, right? So that can't be it. So why? Is it affecting you? Have you been told that you lost your job because a person who's not here with proper documentation is going to take it from you? Of course, the answer is no. They have no answer to the why question except for I bought into the fear. And that goes into some of the stories we've heard today already is it's easier to buy into the fear than to try to figure out that, you know what, there really is nobody under my bed. There really is nobody in the closet. We've just got to figure out a logical solution to our problems, right? So I co-sponsored the bill that's on today. I co-sponsored it before as well. When I heard testimony when I was on transportation, I mean, the fact is that we want people who are driving on our roads to be insured. I want my 16-year-old who got his license last month, congratulations to him. Sorry to those of you on the road, but promise he's pretty slow. But I want him, if he's confronted with a driver that he has an accident, I want them insured. And I don't know anybody who wouldn't want safer roads. And this makes the roads safer, right? Does it give some sort of validity to somebody to say, well, now I'm one step closer to being a real American because I have a driver's license? I don't think so. Maybe it's sort of like having a college ID in that kind of, using it for a form of ID, but that's not the case. It's panic, it's fear, and it's they have something that I have too, and that makes them more like me, and that doesn't make me feel good at all. The other bill that we have is called the Safe Communities Act, and that's a bill that's really a political tool that's been used, frankly, by both sides of the immigration issue, because some people in the media have called it a sanctuary state bill. And let me tell you, there's no such thing as a sanctuary state, because the thing that most people think a sanctuary state is it's a place where people who are immigrants who are here without paperwork can come in, proper documentation can come in, and the federal government can't get in because it's a sanctuary, right? And that's not the case. We're part of the United States of America. The federal government can do their job here in Massachusetts. We can't stop that. I think that was tried in the last century, the century before the last one. It was called the Civil War. We're part of this country. And we can't, what we can do, though, is we can tell the federal government, look, if you're going to do work that we find completely antithetical to our values as Massachusetts residents and as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we're not going to help you. So you can't co-opt our workers in the court system, our workers in the prison system, and our state police to help you, because our tax dollars are used to solve state problems. Our tax dollars are used to address our transportation problems, our education problems, and other state-related issues, not to get involved in immigration enforcement. And it's that part of that bill that I support and always have, and in principle I support that bill. It's a matter of federalism, really. That's not our job. So will you be introducing the Congressman? I'm going to turn it back to you, Rabbi. Okay. So I'm going to turn it back to the Rabbi who's going to introduce the Congressman. Thank you for including me. And I know we're going to take questions later.
You didn't clap for me when I finished with it. Thank you. I do not speak with Congressman Moulton 5 times a week, but I did meet him once, and I'm sure he remembers it very well. Not. It was after the Charlottesville incident, and the congressman came to Bedford High School and spoke beautifully about the horror that had taken place at that time, and how we all need to unite and stand up to the hate that was on display on that occasion. And I was so very impressed with his words at that time, and how passionate he was about I think we share many of the same values. And then he chose to come outside afterwards. We were having a demonstration, and join us there as well. He chose to continue to be part of that candlelight vigil that some of you may have been there for. So I was so very impressed with your words and your passion and your values. The congressman he's been the congressman of the 6th District of Massachusetts since 2014, and he ran on a platform of bringing a new generation of leadership to Washington, and has been working to deliver on that promise since then. He's the vice-ranking member of the House Budget Committee, where he has used his position to push back against the president's cut to funding for the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, limit the use of government money to separate parents from their children, and sponsor more than 50 bills to rebuild and fix the nation's broken immigration system. More recently, he has used his position on the Budget Committee and the House Armed Service Committee to grill the leaders of ICE, the Defense Department, the Census, the Department of Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services about the president's failed foreign policy contributing to the flow of immigrants to the border. He used this position to demand resignations of top officials,
like Kirsten Nielsen, who implemented many of the most controversial of the administration's immigration policies. Seth lives in Salem with his wife and their daughter, Emmy, and it is my privilege and honor to introduce Congressman Seth Moulton.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's an honor to be here. In addition to Representative Gordon, who I'm so glad could join me here, Margaret Fleischman and Martha Simon are both here, I think. Yes. So my most important mentor in life, the person who inspired me to join the Marines, which inspired me to get into politics, and therefore someone who I wouldn't be here without, was the Reverend Peter J. Gomes. Now, he was the longtime minister at Harvard. Listen to this guy, gay, black, Republican, American Baptist minister, okay? I mean, extraordinary independent American. Someone who represents the best values of our country. And one of the many lessons he gave to me was that if you're going to speak, you always have to have a text. Now, what he was referring to is if you are giving a sermon in a house of worship. And I'm not here to give a sermon, but I am in a house of worship. And so the text that I have chosen for today is Hebrews 13:2. Be not afraid to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Now, I grew up knowing that verse from the Bible as Uncle Andy's Bible verse. And that's because my uncle, Andrew, was born with Down syndrome. He was part of another group targeted by the Nazis. And when he was born, my grandparents were told to not even bring him home from the hospital, that he'd be disruptive for his 6 brothers and sister, including my mom, that he should go straight to an institution. But that's not what my grandparents did. They welcomed their new son into their home. And he became an amazing part of our family, of my life growing up, and of his entire community out in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. He sadly died a few years ago, but hundreds of people came to his funeral, people who had no idea he even knew, because he had touched their lives. And I think that Bible verse is very applicable today as we think about our country, our society's role in entertaining strangers from other countries, and how it goes to the core values that this country is supposed to represent. Rabbi, you chose a historical analogy to underline your sermon, which absolutely deserved a round of applause. It was very moving. And it was an analogy that I actually got in big trouble for using when I became the first member of Congress, to say that the rise of Trump reminds me of the rise of Hitler. And a lot of people told me that that was extremist, that that was inappropriate, that I shouldn't be saying things like that. Of course, many people, not just yourself, have made that analogy since then. And I think that it is frightening how many parallels there are between that historical moment and today. And maybe the massacres are not as bad at the moment. The policies haven't been taken to such extremes. But we're heading in that direction. And it's happening on our watch. It's happening before our eyes. So I want to just make a couple of comments about this situation and just how it's affected me personally. The first is that, I mentioned that I wouldn't be here as a member of Congress if not for my time in the Marines. That's really what introduced me to the consequences of failed leadership in Washington as part of the war in Iraq. And I was in the first company of Marines into Baghdad. I was fighting on the ground in the infantry. But one of the most profound jobs I had in Iraq was actually hosting an Iraqi TV show. And I was the host of an Iraqi TV show with my translator, Muhammad, because we were trying to bring a free press to Iraq. I mean, he said, look, they asked us to start a democracy here. Well, we need to have a free press if you want to have a democracy. Not something this administration seems to believe, but we knew it was important in the Marine Corps. And so my job as a young lieutenant, because we didn't have enough people in the State Department, was to go and work with the local Iraqi media to teach them how to have a free press. Because the TV station, they just played tapes from the Ministry of Information in Baghdad. They had no idea what a free press was all about. But as a result of this work, Muhammad and I, we did a few public service announcements that proved surprisingly popular. Before I knew it, I was signing autographs in the street. Thank you, Ken. We get fan mail. We became a very popular show on TV. When I go back to Baghdad today as a member of the Armed Services Committee, I'm still recognized on the streets. Not a single one of you has asked for my autograph today. I mean, should run for president over there, perhaps. But it also put Muhammad front and center as a so-called collaborator with the Americans, as someone who was an early target of the insurgents, of different terrorist groups, because everyone knew who he was. He was literally a TV star. Now, Muhammad came to America on a Fulbright scholarship. I'd like to say I helped him get here. He actually came on his own. But when he was here, Iraq descended into a civil war. His family was threatened because of Muhammad's work with us, so much so that they had to move. They had to leave the city that they're from, move to a different city. And he knew it was a death sentence to go back, so he applied for asylum. And for the next year, Muhammad, an asylum refugee, lived in my family's home. He was trying to do everything by the books. That meant he couldn't even work, so we had to have a place to live. I wish I had been on that first debate stage for the presidential race, because I would have liked to say, how many other people here have hosted an asylum refugee in their home? To understand on a personal level what this is all about. Muhammad risked his life not just for Iraq, but for America. He's not just an Iraqi hero, he's an American hero. And yet, even going through all the proper channels, he just barely made it through the system to stay here legally and not face a death sentence by going to Iraq. Incidentally, he became an Arabic teacher after he finally got his work permit. In fact, he became Phillips Academy Andover's first ever Arabic teacher in its 200-plus year history. He has since gone on to serve the government more directly. He currently works in the State Department. He continues to give back to the country that gave him his freedom, that gave him his life. I mean, he even likes George W. Bush because he started the Iraq War. I won't go there, but Muhammad, remember the good old days when that was our biggest problem? Yeah. Muhammad is a great example of why our immigration policy matters. And for me, a very personal story of why I'm invested in this issue. The second story I want to share is one that's perhaps more close to home for many of you here today, which is the story from Lynn, who I visited in April. She came to the U.S. in 1993 to settle here. Her husband followed, she followed her husband. She was from Guatemala, one of the countries in this triangle in Central America, where people are fleeing not to steal our jobs, but they're fleeing for their lives. It's a lot of work to pick up your family and leave the only home you've known to come to a foreign country. But they're doing it because their lives are under threat, and that was the story with. She and her husband have 4 sons, one who came to the U.S. with them as a baby. He's a dreamer, American in every way except on paper. the other 3 of whom were born in America and are therefore American citizens. But in 2009, his husband was deported 19 years after he came to America because of a DUI conviction several years earlier. Because the case and her son's case are tied to his husband's, ICE also deported his oldest son and ordered her deportation as well. Now remember, he has 3 sons who are American citizens, just full stop. So she had to make a choice that no mother should ever have to make. Do I follow my husband and 1 son to Guatemala? Or do I stay with the other 3 members of my family here in America? She chose to keep her kids here in Lynn and to do her best to stay as well. The night that ICE decided to deport her, about a quarter century after she arrived in America, she was in a government van heading to the airport when a snowstorm canceled her flight. The van turned around, and the next morning fled to a local church where she's lived in hiding every day since. Several members of the synagogue have helped her maintain her very limited freedom now at that church. When I hear the president talking about separating families, I'm not just thinking about the life-threatening, abhorrent situation that you described at the southern border. I'm thinking about people like right here in our community, way up north in Massachusetts. The Senate and President can fix this, of course. A bill I co-sponsored, H.R. 6, the American Dream and Promise Act, would create a pathway to citizenship for people like his son. We could make temporary protected status that has helped many from these oppressed countries come here and become parts of our communities, make that permanent. And we could do a lot more with true comprehensive immigration reform. I don't think the president wants to do it at the end of the day because he wants to play the politics of this. Of course, he's playing with people's lives. And one last story very quickly. To try to understand this situation better, I organized a trip to the border last year, as many members of Congress have done. But unlike the typical congressional trip where you go for 5 hours and see a detention facility and hold a press conference, we spent 2 days there. And we were, I think to date, the only delegation that spent a lot of time on the Mexican side of the border, not just the American side. We saw a lot of things in Juarez, Mexico, but perhaps the most profound was a house full of deported veterans. Deported veteran is a term that should not exist. We met with a man who had served in the United States Navy for about 2 decades. He was so proud of his hard work in the bowels of a destroyer. But he admitted that one of the only downsides to serving in the Navy was that he developed an addiction problem. He drank too much. And at one point he had a DUI. A DUI like his husband. A DUI like, by the way, many colleagues of mine in Congress have. He did his time for his DUI. He paid the price according to the American legal system. But when he got out, after he had done his time, he was deported. He was sent to Mexico, a country that he doesn't know. He hadn't been there since he was 16 years old. His parents are American citizens. His kids are American citizens. He just didn't bother to get his paperwork done when he was in the Navy. He doesn't have any family in Mexico. That's why he's living at this house set up of fellow deported veterans. Amazingly, he's still proud of his country. He's proud of his service in the United States Navy. But America has let him down. I'm sure you all have stories like these as well that bring you here this afternoon. And I wish I could stand up here and after telling you these sad stories of sharing part of why this matters so much to me, I could end on an optimistic note to give you hope. But I'm not going to give you false hope. And there's not a lot of true hope, real hope to go around today. I think we have to be honest about that. This is a tough road ahead. And it's why it matters that every single one of you is invested enough in this issue to come here and join in this conversation. So let's make it a conversation. I'm happy to turn it over to you for your thoughts and your questions. Thank you.